Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our conversation titled Guantanamo Injustice, Impunity, and the Fight for Accountability. I'm really excited to be in conversation with one of my favorite Guantanamo attorneys, Alka Pradhan, who has done extraordinary and tremendous work on Guantanamo and also in particular in her defense of a incarcerated Muslim man named Ammar al-Baluchi. Before we get a little bit deeper into that, I wanted to just talk briefly about Muslim Counterpublics Lab as well as the Guantanamo Survivors Fund. So, as we know, yesterday was the International Day for Human Rights. Of course, while we witnessed numerous states across the world, celebrating this day and, theoretically claiming to want to uphold and adhere to human rights norms, this has never really been the case, and in particular when it comes to the United States. So I just want to place our conversation in that context, and being that it was just yesterday, thinking about, of course, rooting this conversation in human rights and what human rights have meant at Guantanamo Bay. So my name is Dr. Maha Hilal, and I'm the Executive Director of Muslim Counterpublics Lab. Muslim Counterpublics Lab is an organization that was founded in March of 2022, and the mission of the organization is to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. We have 3 programs, including our Narrative Power program, our Political Education and Organizing program, and lastly, our Redressing Injustice Help Desk. We will have more information for you towards the end, but you can see on the bottom of the screen where you can follow us and get more information about Muslim Counterpublics Lab. As part of the work of Muslim Counterpublics Lab, we also have been part of the creation of the Guantanamo Survivors Fund, which we helped to found in April of 2022, along with Mansour Adaifi, who's our outreach director. What was then called No More Guantanamos is now the Guantanamo Survivors Fund, and Witness Against Torture. And the goal of Guantanamo Survivors Fund is to support the men who have been transferred out of the prison in rebuilding their lives post-Guantanamo and post-torture. This is also in the context of the fact that the United States government often abandons the men who are transferred out of the prison and, sends them to countries where they have no knowledge of the language, the culture. Often they have no legal status, cannot gain any sort of meaningful employment. So obviously, this leaves them in extremely precarious situations. So in the course of the operations of the Guantanamo Survivors Fund, we've raised a little over $100,000 and have provided small grants to about 40 Muslim men, survivors of Guantanamo. And obviously the need far exceeds what we have raised and the number of men who we've helped. So we are really trying to push for raising more money this year as part of our end of the year fundraising campaign in order to support as many men as possible in the coming year. So our goal today for this particular program is to raise $1,500. And you can see again on the bottom of the screen that there's a link that you can follow, both to learn more about the fund and to donate. So please give what you can. These men really need our support, especially in the face of the U.S. government abandoning the men and leaving them to fend for themselves. So I want to get to introducing Alka, who has a very extensive bio because she is an expert and she's brilliant and again, has been such a crucial part of the fight for justice at Guantanamo. So Alka Pradhan is an expert on the application of human rights and humanitarian law to counterterrorism situations and all aspects of the prohibition of torture, from prevention to litigation and accountability. She is currently Human Rights Counsel at the Guantanamo Bay Military Commissions, representing one of the defendants in the capital case of United States versus Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the 9/11 case, and associate counsel for Al Hassan A.G. Abdul Aziz A.G. Ahmed A.G. Mahmoud at the International Criminal Court. I'm not sure that's how you pronounce it. Ms. Pradhan has worked closely with members of the UK Parliament and the European Parliament on official investigations into torture and war crimes. Additionally, she's an active participant in the UN human rights mechanisms with submissions or presentations on behalf of clients to the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the UN Committee Against Torture, the Human Rights Committee, and the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. She has co-written or advised on several amicus curiae briefs submitted to the US Supreme Court. And then finally, I can't read all of her bio because it's so long and she's amazing. Ms. Pradhan is a member of the drafting group of experts on the principles of effective interviewing to be formally adopted by the United Nations. She is a frequent commentator in the media on international law, counterterrorism, and torture issues, and has written law review and media articles on the relationship between human rights and national security and the litigation of torture. Her work has been profiled by the New York Times Magazine, in the documentary The Trial, and in several books about Guantanamo Bay. So we're really, really fortunate to have Alka with us today, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout the program. I've prepared a number of questions for Alka, but of course, this is a great opportunity to ask her about Guantanamo Bay, particularly as we enter into the Trump administration, where the situation will, of course, become, exponentially more precarious. So the first question I want to ask you, Alka, is if you could tell us a little bit about your long-standing work on Guantanamo and what changes you've seen. I hesitate to say both positive and negative. I'm not sure if there is anything positive, but if you could just share a little bit about the work that you've been doing over, the last many years of your litigation and advocacy.
Of course. Well, and first I want to say just thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And thank you again personally to you, Maha, for all of your support of our work for many, many years. So we are incredibly grateful to all of that. So I have worked on Guantanamo for about a little over a decade now, about 11 years. I started out on the habeas side, representing detainees who are eligible to be cleared for release and then negotiating their releases to many countries. And I know you alluded to the fact that there's so little support for these men once they're released. And so I've had a little bit of experience with some of that. And then in 2015, I moved over to what we call the military commission side of Guantanamo, which is the small group of men who are actually being prosecuted by the US government in front of what they call the military commission at Guantanamo Bay. And these include the formerly 5, now 4 men who are being prosecuted specifically for the acts of 9/11, and then the individual, Mr. al-Nashiri, who's being prosecuted for the USS Cole bombing, and another gentleman named Hadi al-Iraqi, who is prosecuted on charges arising out of the law of war. There are also a couple of other military commission cases involving the Bali bombings that are currently underway. But so I represent Ammar al-Baluchi, who is one of the 4 remaining defendants in the 9/11 case. And what's legally interesting but frustrating about what we do at the military commissions is that the military commission at Guantanamo is very different from military commissions historically. Because military commissions are not a new concept in military law. They've been convened many times over the course of hundreds of years, including for the Civil War and post-World War II. But the military commissions at Guantanamo are unique because it's the first time that they've ever been convened against individuals who are alleged to be terrorists or who are alleged to have participated in terrorist acts, who we usually treat as criminals under domestic law, and we bring them to criminal court. And it's really, the military commission at Guantanamo is sort of the last step in a series of departures from the law that the United States engaged in post 9/11. The first, of course, being, well, I hesitate to say what the absolute first was because there's so many, but that included obviously the invasion into Afghanistan, the conflation of Taliban and Al Qaeda as all the same, which of course they're not. And then the establishment of the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, and the establishment of the CIA torture program with black sites abroad, where the decision was made by the United States early on to hold men rather than bringing them to a domestic court and trying them for acts of terrorism if they had those suspicions. They made a decision to hold them abroad, torture them there to get more information, and not prosecute them. That was and I think a lot of people aren't aware that that was a deliberate decision that was made. It was only in 2006 when it became clear that they could not hold these men in the black sites forever, Amara included, that they ended up bringing them to Guantanamo and said, oh, well, what can we do with them here? I guess we have to prosecute them because now people know that they're there. And that's when this whole backwards process began of, okay, let's have a military commission. How do we get the evidence? We've already tainted it through torture. And that's where this whole long saga began. And the 9/11 case now, the second iteration of the 9/11 case has been in pre-trial hearings for, we're about to enter our 14th year, which is just unheard of in United States jurisprudence and I think most countries' jurisprudence. So that's for a number of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about. But that's sort of a kind of quick nutshell of what I've done.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, you started talking about this in your response, but, what are the sort of unique ways that the prison, Guantanamo prison, and the detention of the Muslim men at Guantanamo have highlighted, some of the really fundamental flaws in the US's judicial and military justice systems?
Well, the first is what you just said, is that this is a detention facility and court that are established solely for non-citizen Muslim men, which is just blatantly illegal under international law. And we have submitted these arguments to, for example, the Committee on All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the UN Human Rights Committee, the Special Rapporteur on the independence of the judiciary, about the fact that this is really a purpose-built court only for Muslim men. That's the first issue. The second is that the military commissions are really, at Guantanamo, are built for and around the torture of the men. There is a specific provision in the Military Commissions Act, and if any lawyers in the audience want to look it up, it's Section 948R, that allows the inclusion of what they call coerced evidence. And the reason for the inclusion of that provision is because, look, at the time that the 2009 Military Commissions Act was drafted, they knew full well that these men had been held for 3 to 4 years incommunicado in these black sites abroad, where they were just absolutely brutally tortured, including all the waterboarding you hear about, but many other techniques that constituted torture. And so they had to come up with a way to be able to use the evidence that the statements that these men made once they got to Guantanamo, almost immediately after their time at the black sites, that were influenced by the torture that they'd suffered at the black sites, without actually using what they said in the black sites, right? So how this played out is, Ammar, for example, was held for 3.5 years in 5 different black sites. He was sleep deprived for, almost the entirety of that period of time, using first music and then white lights. He was the first few weeks of his detention included all the terrible techniques that we've heard about. He was walled. He's got brain damage from having his head against a wall multiple times. He's got he was held in stress positions. He was shackled to the ceiling. He was sleep deprived. He was beaten. He was water doused, which is essentially the same as waterboarding, except it's done on the floor with a towel and on a tarp instead of an actual board that goes up and down. All of these things were done to him, and he made statements that were, inculpatory during that torture. They couldn't use those statements taken in 2003, 2004, 2005 while he's at the black site. So what they did is, when he came to Guantanamo, they reinterrogated him. The U.S. government used FBI agents to reinterrogate him. FBI agents who had been involved in sending questions to the black sites in the first place, and who'd known the whole time what his answers had been under torture. Those same FBI agents went to Guantanamo, reinterrogated him there, And then the government's position now is that, look, because we weren't beating him and throwing water at him and mock drowning him during those few hours when the FBI agents were interrogating him at Guantanamo, those statements he made are now admissible under that section of the Military Commissions Act as maybe coerced, maybe not statements. Those are the clean statements. And our argument has always been that in no court in the United States, certainly, and in no human rights court or international court have statements like these ever been found to be usable. These are very clearly the product of torture, and only the Guantanamo Bay Military Commission is trying to use them here. Now, there are many other issues involved in both detention and the military commissions that have arisen. There are things like the independence of the military judge. We've had a series of military judges over time, over these many, many years of pretrial hearings. Some, I think, have made greater effort than others to be independent. And every time they have exercised their independence, they've been cut off at the knees by higher-ups in the federal government, which is illegal. Which is what we call in military law unlawful interference. A very recent example of that is the other defendants in the 9/11 case, you may have seen the headlines, came to plea agreements with the convening authority, who is the official at the Department of Defense authorized to enter into plea agreements with the accused. And basically the minute, 2 days after that happened, the Secretary of Defense reached down and said, I don't think this is a good idea. I am going to revoke the authority I'm going to revoke the plea agreements and the authority of the convening authority to enter into those plea agreements. It is blatantly illegal on its face. There's a plethora of legal authority on this, but it forces us to then go and litigate both unlawful interference and the validity of the plea agreements that have already been entered into, and that is currently ongoing. So there are many, many, many issues over the years that have arisen like this. I haven't even gotten into government intrusion into attorney-client privilege. They've read our emails. They've listened to phone calls. They've listened to our meetings. We found listening devices in our meeting rooms. Things like that. It's just this ongoing struggle to the point where we don't believe, and I would venture to say that there are many in the government as well that do not believe that it is possible to have a fair trial for 9/11 anymore.
So I'm going to ask you a question actually about the plea deals that I had a little earlier, but since you mentioned it, I thought this would be a good time. So I know that in November, the plea deals were revived by a military judge. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of tell us the status of that, what you expect will happen, if there will be another move from the Secretary of Defense, and also, does it have any implications for Amar's case?
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because the reason I am talking to you from the vestibule of our office, which is a secure facility, is precisely because of that. So what happened, let me back up. What happened in November is as soon as the Secretary of Defense revoked or purported to revoke these plea deals, there was litigation around, and the military judge allowed us to participate, even though we did not sign a plea agreement on behalf of Amar, allowed us to participate in litigation because the Secretary of Defense's memo included no plea agreement, no future plea agreements, essentially, with Mr. al-Baluchi as well. So we all briefed these issues of, is the Secretary of Defense really allowed to do this or not? And in November, the military judge ruled in a lengthy, really longer than usual ruling that was very, very clearly reasoned, including all the precedents on military law, that in fact, no, the Secretary of Defense has given this authority to the convening authority, and the convening authority must be allowed to exercise that authority as she or he sees fit, without interference from the executive branch. It was honestly a really well-reasoned argument, and so the government sort of sat on it for a little bit and made a decision that they were going to appeal. After, I'm sure, a directive from the Secretary of Defense. And so they filed their appeal before the sort of second level of, excuse me, but at second level of fake court that's been established by the Military Commissions Act, which is the Court of Military Commission Review, the CMCR. The hierarchy is the Military Commission at Guantanamo, the CMCR, and then after that, appeals go to the DC Circuit, finally jumps into federal court, which we all acknowledge to be valid courts. And so the government recently filed their appeal just about a week and a half ago, before the CMCR, and only filed it with regards to the three gentlemen who had signed plea agreements. They excluded us. We said, excuse me, the Secretary of Defense's memo includes Mr. Al-Baluchi, and so we're all implicated by his unlawful interference, and we are all going to file briefs. And those briefs are due today before the Court of Military Commission Review. So we're going to be filing those shortly, actually in a few hours, and then we'll have we'll have a ruling from the CMCR presumably soon on that issue, because the military judge who issued that ruling that's now being appealed has set dates for the entering of pleas by Mr. Mohammed and Mr. Binatash and Mr. Al-Hassawi for the scheduled January hearing. And he has scheduled that to begin on January 6th. And so the government and the Court of Military Commission Review does not have a very large window of time to issue a ruling before the Military Commission starts taking those pleas. And there are a lot of considerations at play here, including there's an interest of justice issue in getting those pleas entered as soon as possible, soon after the plea agreements are signed. But there's also, some considerations around the change of administration that we don't know how that may impact this particular issue. So that's the current state of play.
So I'm going to ask you a question that I didn't have listed, just based again on the plea deals. What do you think was fundamentally at the heart of Secretary Lloyd's decision to revoke the plea deals? Obviously, we know there's a lot of politics. And, it seems like Guantanamo is otherwise a dormant issue until there is, one whisper of something conceivably positive that could happen. And then secondly, I know that the 9/11 families are often included in some sort of the processes around what justice looks like, but they're also very weaponized as well. So I'm just curious, because there were both families that supported the plea deals and families who did not, what actual role do you think that plays in the decisions by the government?
Sure. With regards to the Secretary of Defense's decision, certainly at the time in early August when he issued that first memo, the thought was that it must be because he doesn't want an impact on the current campaign, right? The presidential election. That was the thought. There was no real reasoning aside from what he said in his memo that he believed that they should have a capital trial. And with great respect to the Secretary of Defense, what he believes is neither here nor there. It's not relevant to what the interests of justice dictate and what the convening authority finds. And so, that was sort of the thought. And I think that the idea was that maybe and I apologize for the phone ringing behind me, but I think the thought was that if the election were over, perhaps there would be a rethinking of this position. And it turns out, no, because post-election, when the Military Commission issued their ruling, the SecDef decided that, no, we're going to appeal. We're going to double down. And so that's the current state of play. Now, with regards to the victim family members, again, apologies, I'm not sure whose phone that is behind me, but with regards to the family members, I think it's really important what you point out, that they are not a monolith by any stretch of the imagination. There's a large number of victim family members, and I think the first and most important thing to say about them is that, look, none of us can really imagine what it is like, even now, to have a family member who died on September 11th. And it's a very, very difficult question when you put to them what should happen in this case, given the twists and turns over the years. lives. But, you know, we have had over the years a dedicated group of victim family members who have come down to Guantanamo, who have seen the proceedings, who have participated, who have asked us questions, who have filed intervening briefs. And I'm just going to turn this off. Give me 1 second. I'm going to find whose this is. All right. Hopefully that's it. Sorry about that. But that group of family members has been very, very vocal in the fact that, look, we've come down, we've seen how this works, we've seen how broken the system is, and we believe that the best resolution of this case is through plea agreements, not through a trial that will once again raise the issues of torture, raise the issues of U.S. violations over time, right? As much as we as the lawyers would love to air out those issues, there is a very vocal group of victim family members. Now, there are as well, of course, family members who still feel the opposite. Now, what we do see very often in the press are a very small group of those vocal family members who are entitled to their opinions, but it is nevertheless a very small group of people who keep being quoted over and over again in the press, and they feel very strongly, and they're entitled to that. But at the same time, there is not. I will say there's not always overlap between those who feel very strongly about it and those who have come often and seen how it works. And even when there is, we have to look at the whole situation holistically, right? It is a very difficult thing to say in 2024 that there may never be a trial for 9/11, right? I understand that. It was a moment of great trauma for the country, but I think the trauma that occurred afterwards, the sort of self-inflicted trauma of violating our own laws, of undercutting our own values, of and continuously, right, to the present day, justifying those violations, is a trauma that, I don't want to compare the two, but is this sort of ongoing trauma that we don't even necessarily realize is still occurring. And I think we have to think about, when we bring the interests of justice and what a trial would accomplish, as opposed to what, perhaps greater transparency around what happened on 9/11 and greater transparency around what is currently happening at Guantanamo would accomplish for the country.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Just in thinking about, the terrain of what justice looks like. And, one of the things I often think about and articulate is the fact that, there's only so much injustice you can commit on the way to theoretically trying to obtain justice. And so when we see it's not as if Guantanamo, the injustices there have ended, as you've pointed out many times, right? So this is continued injustice. And, to what extent then can the United States still claim that it's actually the purpose of Guantanamo is for justice? So I want to just transition, and I have a lot of questions for you, but just if you could talk more specifically about Ammar al-Baluchi's case. And, I know, of course, that you were in court on Monday arguing for a mixed medical commission. But can you tell us a little bit just about some of the challenges and barriers in his case? And, what are the things you think sort of need to be litigated or gotten out of the way before you can get to the larger issues that his case presents?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the mention of the case that we argued on Monday, because it really comes to the heart again of what his case is, which is torture. The fact of the torture that occurred, the non-recognition of the torture that occurred, the classification of the details of that torture, and the failure, not just failure, but refusal of the United States government to provide medical care for the torture that occurred, not just for Ammar, but for all of the men who remain at Guantanamo and for the men who've been released, right? Who all underwent like brutal torture. And there comes a point where I tell people when I speak, and I'll say it now, that at a certain point, I don't care what you think he did, okay? because that is a separate question from what happened to him after he was taken into custody. Because two things can be true at once, right? It can be true that he is charged with certain acts that have never been proven to this day by the United States. And it can also be true, as is undisputed by the United States, that these horrific things were done to him by US agents, that he continues to endure horrific conditions of confinement at Guantanamo, that I am in the process of writing yet another letter to Southern Command about, right? That will be sent in the next couple of days. And that I had to get up in court on Monday and argue that, look, under this obscure military law that the government uses to justify Amar's detention, there is this little provision that actually compels the government to provide him with an independent medical evaluation. And I say independent because, look, we have DOD medical personnel down at Guantanamo who evaluate him on a constant basis. And they basically say, first of all, I will say, they all agree that he has trauma, PTSD, anxiety, a number of psychological disorders that all stem from his torture. But they don't really treat him for it. And that's partially because Guantanamo Bay was never intended as a long-term detention facility. They just don't have at the detainee hospital the facilities, the personnel, the ability to provide the sort of complex care that torture victims need. And so what we see in the medical records are these DOD personnel sort of minimizing what the actual issues are. Continually. Like, yes, he has anxiety, but he doesn't really need a team to deal with his PTSD. He doesn't really need like ongoing, continuous psychological care to deal with it. Yes, he has a progressive spinal tumor, but no, we don't have to provide, the quality of MRI necessary to conclusively diagnose what sort of spinal tumor he has. Think about that for a minute. Would you, if a family member of yours was diagnosed with a spinal tumor, you would panic, right? And even if it's not cancerous, which we don't know what type it is, even if it's not, for someone who's 47, years old, it is alarming, that sort of diagnosis. And so we had to get up in court and say, look, he is entitled to an independent evaluation by physicians who don't come from the DOD, who don't fall within this chain of command where they're kind of coerced, really, right, into making certain determinations that don't contradict the current line of the U.S. government, which is that they're doing really well at Guantanamo. They have great medical care, right? And the government has taken the position, look, and as recently as Monday, that, no, please, come on, that law doesn't apply to Guantanamo. It's like, but you've applied it for 20 years to Guantanamo when it was in your interest to do so, when it was in your interest to hold these guys forever, you applied that law to Guantanamo. Now, when they're trying to say we have the right under this law, you say, no, it doesn't apply to Guantanamo, right? Those are the sort of games that are played just continuously by the U.S. government that are so immensely frustrating. With regards to Amar, right, he does suffer from his PTSD. He does suffer from brain injuries, multiple brain injuries from his torture. He's got extreme anxiety. He's got paranoia, as one would imagine, right, which is completely normal for torture victims. And he just does not have the care that he needs. And so what you end up having is us, right, his legal team, who are not properly equipped to treat him, trying to go kind of hat in hand to various trauma rehab centers, independent medical providers, and say, what can we do for him? What can he do for himself there as sort of self-treatment in lieu of the government providing him the treatment to which he is entitled? And that is just, it is immensely difficult. And over time, over the course of just, look, the 9 years I've worked with Amar, there has been a serious downturn in his ability to handle both the day-to-day life at Guantanamo, which is incredibly punitive. They're changing the rules constantly. They don't allow him to see his family. They interfere with his communications with us, but also follow what's going on at the military commission. He used to be able to write statements and review our motions, things like that. He can't do that anymore. He can't sit under fluorescent lights for long periods of time anymore. He's only a few years older than me, and he can't do most of these things. And that has been alarming to see.
That's really sad and frustrating. And I know you mentioned that of course, the doctors at Guantanamo are coerced into basically colluding with the U.S. government. And there's also the part that, right, who are the incarcerated men going to actually be able to trust when they know that their medical exams, of course, are going to be manipulated in favor of the government. So I'm, grateful that you brought that up. I want to kind of transition to something else, which is the report that was released by the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while Countering Terrorism on Guantanamo, Fionella Aolane. And I wanted to ask you if you could tell us, because of course this speaks about a lot of the conditions, including the medical conditions. What were some of the most important findings in the report? That's the first question. And then, as you know, the U.S.'s response to the report was, quote, in part, the United States disagrees in significant respects with many factual and legal assertions the Special Rapporteur has made. We are committed to providing safe and humane treatment for detainees at Guantanamo in full accordance with international and U.S. domestic law. Detainees live communally and prepare meals together, receive specialized medical and psychiatric care, are given full access to legal counsel, and communicate regularly with family members. We are nonetheless carefully reviewing the Special Rapporteur's recommendations and will take any appropriate actions as warranted, end quote. So the second question to follow up on the statement is, has the report had any tangible or material impact on the conditions of incarceration at Guantanamo?
No, and I don't mean to laugh. It's far from funny, but if you don't, the old adage, if you don't laugh, you cry. And look, let me start with the response, which we can get that out of the way real fast, which is that the response of the United States there echoes almost word for word the response they've had to every report or statement that has been made by every international agency over the 22 years that Guantanamo, almost 23 years, that Guantanamo has been in existence, right? They made almost word for word the same statement when the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found that Amar's detention was arbitrary and illegal and he should be released immediately. They made almost exactly the same statement before the UN Human Rights Committee last year in October, and I was in Geneva to hear them, the pleasure of hearing them make that statement live. It's boilerplate. It doesn't mean anything. Everyone internationally knows the truth about Guantanamo. And the unique thing about the Special Rapporteur's report is that she was the first outside official who was given access to Guantanamo Bay after a very, very long period, after the entirety of the history of the detention facility at Guantanamo. They'd never let someone in. And so I guess this goes back to your first question, are there any positives? That was a positive, right? Look, I guess minimal credit where it's due. They should be allowing a lot more independent inspections at Guantanamo, but they did allow one independent inspection. And it found what we knew it would find, that there is at a minimum, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment at Guantanamo Bay, even now, even 22 years later. It was hugely significant. She found that with regards to, the fact that the men are constantly surveilled, right? She found that with regards to what I've just been talking about, the provision of medical care to detainees, that it is inadequate, it is insufficient, it does not address the complex conditions that these men suffer. And not just that, but the medical records are redacted, they're not provided in full, there's no effective treatment for a lot of these conditions. I mean, it was brutal, to be perfectly honest. And that's after she went and saw the facilities. And she was very, this wasn't just a hatchet job. If you read the report, right, she does give, frankly, more credit than I necessarily would, but she was extraordinarily even-handed to the extent that she could be, pointing out, where she saw the United States making efforts, where she saw the Joint Task Force or the Joint Medical Group making efforts, but that they just were not sufficient. And then she pointed out as well where certain circumstances in which the secrecy around the place, and this is intentional, right? The secrecy around the place continues to basically is still the priority over the provision of medical care or the provision of a fair trial or any of those guarantees that we consider to be imperative in detention, both under international humanitarian law and under international human rights law. And so it was a staggering report, and all of her conclusions are still relevant today. Have we seen any changes? No, unfortunately not. We did see a little bit of attitude from some of the members of the Joint Task Force after the report was issued. We had some memorable testimony last year by the commander of the Joint Task Force, a gentleman named Colonel Matthew Jamont, who he essentially echoed the position of the United States government that he didn't agree with any of her conclusions. And we also got his opinion that everyone was guilty at Guantanamo. So, that's the view, right? That's still the prevailing view of many in the United States government, is this sort of regressive, non-fact-based view of these detainees in order to justify their continued detention and abuse.
Right, and obviously that the focus on the men who remain incarcerated, has the implication of allowing them to ignore the men who've been transferred out of the prison and who've been completely abandoned. And so I just want to put in a quick plug again for the Guantanamo Survivors Fund. Again, we're trying to raise $1,500 today to support the men who've been transferred out of the prison, and to help them with things like being able to buy a car so that they can sustain themselves, whether it's by driving Uber or a taxi, or being able to get medical care. These are a lot of the things that they need post-transfer, and they desperately need our support again because of how horribly the United States government has destroyed them. So
Can I add to that briefly, Maha? Because what you've just said is so incredibly important, and things like the Survivors Fund are apps. I cannot emphasize enough how critical they are, because the United States government gives nothing to these men when they are released. They are released often now to countries that are not, Muslim majority. Sometimes they don't necessarily have access to their families. Look, my client Imad Hassan, right, former client, was released a few years ago to Oman. Oman actually is one of those countries that has taken care of detainees post-release, and even then, even with that care from Oman, he passed away earlier this year in large part due to the abuse that he had suffered at U.S. hands, both in Afghanistan and then at Guantanamo. And so think about that. If a detainee who did have some measure of care post-Guantanamo can still pass away because of that, think of the detainees who have no such support in the countries to which they were sent, who have no medical support, no financial support. It is an ongoing crisis. It is an ongoing tragedy.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And the fact is, they've never been vindicated. So of course that also comes with the stigma of, being a quote terrorist that haunts them wherever they are. And I think we don't think about it as much because Guantanamo seems like a relic of the past. But obviously there are hundreds of men whose lives have been destroyed.
Yes.
So in light of the fact that, Tina Kadenow, who was the special envoy for the closure of Guantanamo, recently passed away. And to be frank, I wasn't quite sure what she accomplished anyway in that position. What do you think will happen in the coming months? And, given the certainty that, of course, Trump is not going to reinstate this position, what can we expect going forward, both with the men who've been transferred and any potential other transfers?
Well, it is difficult to say. Look, I know. Well, let me say as a preliminary matter that exactly 4 years ago, we meaning like the members of the Human Rights Coalition, as you know, Maha, we're full speed ahead with the Biden transition team on what needed to happen to get rid of Guantanamo once and for all, right? Plead the cases that were ongoing at the military commissions, transfer all the remaining detainees. There were not that many even then, right? There were only a couple more. And the Biden administration has just been an unmitigated disaster on Guantanamo. They did manage to release the Rabbani brothers, also my clients, one of whom passed away in Pakistan recently, which is a horrific tragedy again. They've made a couple of transfers, but no real progress, right? Conditions have remained the same. We're still litigating at the military commissions, and we're going backwards at the military commissions. We take one big step forward, and this administration pulls it right back. So I don't know what their goals really are. There is still a hope that in the 30, 40 days ish before the change administration, that there will be some more men released. I have no further information on that, but there is always hope. Hope springs eternal, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? So there is that hope that maybe they will accomplish something, just as in the waning days of the Obama administration, they managed to transfer some people and get them out before President Trump came in. And then there is some hope regarding the continuing litigation over the plea agreements in at least the 9/11 case, that that the courts, whether it's the Court of Military Commission Review or that the DC Circuit, will recognize that in fact those are valid and should move forward. And that will be a significant step forward if those plea agreements are allowed to progress. So there are a lot of fires burning. We're on a lot of fronts at the moment. And so, I would say watch and wait over the next month and a half, and let's, see what happens.
It will be interesting to watch, and also probably pretty bad. So I have two more questions for you, and then there's a couple of audience questions. So my second to last question is, because I focus a lot on narratives in particular, and the ways that Muslims have been constructed in very demonizing and criminalizing ways, are there any narratives or talking points that you've found to be helpful when advocating for Ammar and injustices at Guantanamo more generally? Because even when we talk about, say Durbin, for example, or Senator Durbin, who is supportive of closing the prison, he rarely, if ever, talks about the humanity of the men. It's always about the cost of the prison, the fact that the prison is a terrorist recruitment tool, as he claims. But none of the discourse seems to support anything remotely positive about who these men are.
Yeah, I completely agree. They're so dehumanized at this point. And that's why you see such apathy from the American public about it. I mean, it's racism at its core, right? That these Muslim men are all kind of nameless, faceless, just, again, a monolith, right? Which is just pure racism. And we do have to overcome that. And so, yes, we tell Ammar's story a lot, but even beyond telling his story, like, one of the things that we talk about a lot in connection with the medical care piece of it is we talk about the ways in which they were tortured and then the conditions with which they live now. And one really effective method of doing that has been through the artwork that they've generated at Guantanamo. And some of you may remember that in 2017, there was a large exhibition with detainee artwork at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. There have been several exhibitions since then of both of Ammar's work and many other detainees' work. And that was really, it really opened this aperture a little bit more, because people saw this artwork and were like, wait a second, these are, these terrible terrorists or, whatever, right? Like, the worst of the worst, drawing roses and children and light and sun and beaches and, and buildings and the San Francisco Bridge and, things they've never seen before, things they can only conceive of, right? And then you had Ammar, who, and some of the others who literally drew their trauma. Ammar has a very, very famous piece called Vertigo, which is just a series of lines and colors, which he drew to illustrate what he sees when he closes his eyes, right, because of his brain injuries. we try to highlight that because, look, I can't quote Ammar. I'm not allowed to because of the classification of this whole case. But what I can do is show you some of his words, show you that have been declassified, and show you this picture, these pictures he's drawn, and say, look, this is a window into what this human being has been through, his thoughts, his likes, his dislikes, right? Things he finds beautiful, things he finds troubling, that coincide with things we find beautiful and troubling. That has been one way, right? One small way in which we can raise an open discussion about the humanity of each one of these men. And they're not all the same, right? They don't all like the same things. They don't all like to draw flowers. Like, you know, they fight amongst themselves over what they like and they dislike and what foods they like and all of that. We also talk a little bit about their families, about where they're from. Look, Ammar is from Balochistan, right? Balochistan has this long, difficult, and rich history of culture and war and oppression that we talk about, that his family has been through, they still live with, and how that affects him now to this day. So, you know, we try and bring all of those different lenses to each one of them, right? Mr. al-Nashiri has a different story. Mr. Muhammad has a very different story. So we try to bring those in as much as we can. Look, Ammar likes to make food, right? He likes to cook for his lawyers with his microwave at Camp 5. He's very, very good at it. In fact, when I was pregnant, he made food for me. These are the stories you don't hear a lot about, and we like to tell when we can.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the art because it's so beautiful, and it's like just oftentimes really jarring, especially when you see the stamp on the back that says like approved by US forces.
Yes.
And then you look at the front and it's a picture of a flower or a picture of a teapot. And I think that contradiction really highlights the violence at Guantanamo. So my last question for you, Alka, is as we continue the fight to close Guantanamo and end torture, how can both pressure internationally and domestically contribute to closing Guantanamo? And there are a lot of us who've been part of the struggle for a very long time, and it's oftentimes been hard to see any significant shifts. So going forward, I mean, what role do you think that can and should play?
Look, first of all, let me thank everyone who has been in this fight for a very, very long time. It is not nothing, right? I mean, look, yes, Guantanamo is still there. Yes, Ammar is still there. Yes, the military commissions still exist, right? But knowing that you all are out there saying this is wrong, this should not take place, even now, even 22 years later, with all of the other issues that are going on, the war in Gaza, genocide, what's happening in Syria, all of these, right, going on, to know that there are still people saying Guantanamo Bay, it should not exist, right, is extraordinarily important, at a minimum, for the mental health of the men, right? So that they know someone is still out there fighting for them. But it's more than that as well, right? What I try to, as I know you know, Maha, we try to highlight the connections, right, between what happened at Guantanamo, what is happening in Israeli prisons, what happened in Syria in the detention centers, right? What is happening in many places around the world, what some of the Western countries have been able to get away with post-Guantanamo because of Guantanamo. So we try to highlight those connections as much as possible. It is not nothing that the United States feels pressure every time they talk about Russia, every time they talk about China, right? Every time they talk about North Korea. They feel pressure. They get blowback from international agencies, from advocacy groups, right? From small and big, right? Going all the way up to the UN agencies, going all the way up to Amnesty, etc., right? About what they're doing at Guantanamo, right? That pressure is felt. Let me tell you, I have had people, members of the NSC, tell me. I have had White House officials tell me. They feel it. They get that blowback. It is not nothing. Even if it doesn't close Guantanamo right now, it's not nothing. I think just being able to illustrate the unanimity right, of all outside observers on this is extraordinarily important. And so I would encourage you, from our little black hole, I would encourage you, please keep speaking about Guantanamo, to the extent possible. And in the context of everything else that's going on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we obviously know the connections between Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and, Sid Timin prison in Israel, for example, and the exchange of tactics. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because there are so many connections that we need to think through in also our advocacy and making the dots connect. So we have a question from Allie from the audience. So I put it on the screen for anyone who's watching. And her question is, what do you expect to happen with the military commissions under Trump? Are there any books or authors that have written on the military commissions that you would recommend?
So, second question first, absolutely. The first book that I would well, three books actually. There's an older one by Jess Braven, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but Jess is a Wall Street Journal reporter who has followed the military commission since its inception, and wrote early on about sort of the weird animal that the Guantanamo military commissions is, I suppose, if we're being grammatically correct in that sentence. The second, more recent, is by Lisa Hajar. And she has been a frequent observer at Guantanamo. She's come down, she's attended a lot of the hearings, and she wrote a brilliant book that was released, today is 2024, I want to say 2022, and detailing the military commissions and the progress, in particular in the 9/11 case, and the centrality of torture and classification of torture to the 9/11 case, and how that's sort of led to this precipice where the government is asking us to negotiate because of all this information that has come out about the torture program through that litigation. And the third, which is not out yet but is available for pre-orders, is by John Ryan of the outlet Law Dragon, the Law Dragon blog. He has come down. He's been he's attended, I think, almost every hearing since 2015. He's always there now with Carol Rosenberg, and his book is coming out. I don't recall the title. I apologize, but his name is literally John Ryan, and he has written at length, in particular, about the litigation of the torture. So I would recommend those three books very, very highly. And then, in terms of what do we expect to happen under Trump, man, it's anyone's guess, right? Previously, it was status quo. We just kept having pretrial hearings, and nothing really changed. Nothing got better, but nothing really changed, which was, at the time kind of okay with us, as opposed to getting worse. We've heard rumors that the current nominee for SecDef would like to speed things up. Every time they've tried to do that, things have failed. So, we'll wait and see. The good thing about the Gitmo bar is we're used to pivoting no matter what. So we'll be there. We'll be ready to litigate. We'll be ready to litigate in federal court. If they decide to suspend the whole thing, we'll be ready to litigate down there and continue litigating the torture issues if they don't.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the suggestions, and we can definitely send out a follow-up email.
Yes, and I can get you all those titles as well.
Okay, perfect. So I think we just have time for this one more question, and I want to respect Roshni's time, who's helping us on the back end. So it comes from a friend of mine, Ibad, who is a PhD student at Syracuse University. So he is asking about the personal toll, all of this takes detention and torture on the men at Guantanamo, but also for lawyers like you who have been, working on these cases for a really long time.
Wow. Well, thank you for that question. I will tell you, when I first started this work, I was like, we're fine. We're, what are we doing, right? And over time, I would say with the litigation of the torture in particular over the past 5 years, I have realized that no, in fact, there is such a thing as vicarious trauma, and we all have it. So let me start with the men because they're the most important. I talked briefly before about how difficult it has been to watch Amar's deterioration over time, and that it is absolutely heartbreaking, and that is true for all the men down there. We have watched all of them sort of their mental health suffer, their physical health, right? They're all getting older. Everyone knows that you age more quickly in prisons than you do in the outside world, and particularly when you're a torture victim. And so it is physically taxing for them, but it is also just year after year after year of not seeing their families, of kids growing up, daughters, sons getting married without them, children being born, grandchildren being born, right? And they don't see their families. They have what you said in the government statement, right? Like, they have communication with their families. No, they don't really. They have these sort of weird, some of them have weird phone calls. Amar doesn't. He's not entitled to as sort of someone who's being prosecuted. These weird sort of non-simultaneous video communications that it's not. They don't see their family members. They haven't met their family members in 20-some years. It's really debilitating. It's really depressing. So it's extraordinarily difficult. I would say for us, it is being immersed in the details of their torture, especially for those of us litigating, all the time is very hard. It is, it's not as hard as living with it, but it is hard. And we have to constantly check in on each other, right? Maha, I watch a lot of junk TV. And just keep in mind that we are the only conduits for them, right? Like, we're basically all they have. So we go into these meetings, we let them get out whatever they can get out, because they don't have real psychotherapy. They don't really have another outlet. They don't have their family. So sometimes that means you walk out of a meeting feeling like you've got Amar's blood all over you, that's the best way I can describe it. And you have to just take a minute and try to translate that into action. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Alka, for being here with us today and just all your incredible work. I mean, I think it takes a lot of really special people to do this kind of work, to be committed to this work as long as you have been. So I'm just so happy you were able to join us and that people could benefit from your expertise and your knowledge. And, whenever there is a way that we can, advocate for Ammar, of course, definitely let us know. And for everyone watching, again, you've heard a lot about the injustices at Guantanamo that continue, both in terms of the men who remain incarcerated, but also the men who've been transferred. So again, we would be really grateful if you could help us support the men who've been transferred out of the prison by donating to the Guantanamo Survivors Fund. Our goal was to raise $1,500 today, and we really, really, really need the money, and that would only really go to support one individual survivor. So whatever you can give, please do give. We are basically the only lifeline for the men at this point, and we can barely give them much at all. So again, grateful to you, Alka, for joining us today, and grateful to all of you watching. And we will be following up with an email with some of the resources that Alka mentioned, as well as some of the other items you should be watching on Guantanamo, including events commemorating the anniversary in January. So thank you all so much, and take care.
Thank you.